First of all, we have 3 items, applications to be determined today, and obviously we'll start through the agenda now. So the first item is apologies for absence.
Thank you, Chairman. I don't have any apologies for absence.
Thank you. I was then thinking, before I go on to the Vice Chairman, perhaps this would be opportune for members to introduce themselves, because I know there's some members, I'm looking for the new member, can't see them, who perhaps don't know the committee. So can we just do a quick 5 minutes, everybody saying who they are? I think that would be useful. Obviously, I'm Caroline Jones, the chair of the committee.
I'm Mark Fliss, sir. Yeah. I'm Mark Fliss. I'm a Bucks councillor for Old Amersham and an Amersham Town councillor.
Can we start with you, Rachel, and then go?
I'm Rachel Matthews, councillor for Little Chalfont, Amersham Common.
I'm Jonathan Rush. Who can't work his thing? Oh, can I? I think you've got to switch off, haven't you? I've got red meant to stop. I'm Jonathan Rush, councillor for Chalfont St Peter.
I'm Liz Walsh, councillor for Amersham and Chesham Boys.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Waters. I'm councillor for Penwood and Old Amersham.
Good evening. I'm Isobel Darby, councillor for Chalfont St Peter.
Graham Harris, councillor for Amersham and Chesham Boys.
Shocking behaviour, Chair. How could you forget me as I'm one of the grand old damies? I'm Jane MacBean from Chiltern Ridges.
I'm Ranjit Gatora. I'm the legal officer.
I'm Rebecca Binstead and I'm the Democratic Services Officer.
I'm Liz Hundren. I'm from Sear Green Parish Council.
Carl Jackson, councillor for Chalfont St Giles.
Yes, Chairman. I'm just slightly confused. This is my first meeting. I attended the very first meeting of this of this committee, when I believe there were 3 other members, and I now see that there's a different member there who isn't here tonight, and the 3 other members aren't here. So I just wonder what has happened, please.
The committee has changed, you're quite right, and there are, I believe, 2 vacancies, and the group seemingly at the last meeting decided not to fill those vacancies at the moment. It was due to the political balance being changed, as I understand it.
Perhaps we can take this offline, Chairman.
I was at the group meeting and I didn't realise there was any discussion, don't recall any discussion whatsoever about vacancies on the planning committee and not being filled.
But I wasn't at that particular group meeting, and that was the information I was given when I asked about it. And I did confirm with you, Rebecca, that was the case, wasn't it?
Yes, we did contact the group leaders, and yeah, there's still 2 vacant seats at the moment.
Yeah. Yes.
Chairman, can I just say, nothing to do with politics at all, but this committee was formed with, I believe, either 12 or 13 members. I feel quite uncomfortable that there are fewer than that number. It was agreed a long time ago when the council was constituted we should have that number, and I strongly believe one of the reasons we have local planning committees is so that local people can determine those applications which are potentially quite contentious, and I feel quite uncomfortable with the fact that this committee is under strength, and we also have a non-attendee this evening as well. So I just would like that minuted, please.
I thought I had, sorry. Where were we? No declarations of interest. 2 sets of minutes for approval. The first one was the 6th of April. Can I take it members approve of these minutes, or are there any alterations? Agreed. Thank you. Yes, well, there wasn't many, was there? And then the minutes of the 26th of May, which was the meeting of the full council, where I believe we were all present. And again, are those minutes agreed? Agreed. Thank you. So we have 3 applications to be determined tonight, and we have 2 speakers on the first one, Councillor Carl Jackson and Councillor Liz Hungan. Now, just for information, you have 3 minutes each. The clock is set up here, and Councillor Jackson, if you'd like to go first, and when I think Becca, are you starting the clock for Councillor Jackson? Yeah, okay. You happy to start when Becky gets it? Thank you.
Shall I wait till the clock is started? There we go. Thank you, Chairman. I note that the case officer has recommended refusal for this application. That's something I welcome, and I know, having checked, I speak on behalf of my fellow ward councillors, Rouse and Butcher, that they welcome the recommendation for refusal too. However, since this application was called in, regardless of the officer decision, and a significant number of local residents have objected, I'm grateful for the opportunity to address the committee. Residents raised about 20 different objections, but I want to focus on just 2 in the time available. The first is that, if approved, this application would represent, in my view, the creation of and the start of a slippery slope towards further linear development, which is quite out of character with the nature of Cllr Green as a village. Cllr Green has developed, as many villages have around here, in a kind of cluster around a central area of shops and a church and a sort of community centre. This development down Chalfont Road, which is an area not of constant development but of occasional sort of patchy developments, small developments, scattered houses and equestrian centres, would be quite out of keeping with what's gone before. The second and final point I want to raise is that this is a Greenbelt site. Members of this committee don't need me to tell them there is a presumption against development of this type on Greenbelt land. The application relates in no way to a massive development, but it is nevertheless one which, if approved, would have a negative impact on the openness of the Greenbelt and damage one of the purposes of the Greenbelt to prevent encroachment on the countryside. Neither I nor my fellow ward councillors see any special or exceptional circumstances which would justify a rebuttal of the presumption against development in this case, and I would be grateful if the committee would consider upholding the officer's recommendation for refusal. Thank you, Chairman.
Cllr Green Parish Council and residents believe that the proposal to build 8 houses on a parcel of land outside the northwest boundary of our village is inappropriate and ill-conceived and will shut off the uninterrupted view of the paddocks and spectacular sunsets that we currently enjoy. Our village opens up at this point on the Chalfont Road as you exit towards Chalfont St Giles, with the applicant's land on the left and further paddocks on the right-hand side. This amenity would be lost with a development such as this, and would inevitably lead to further ribbon expansion northwards and the loss of our village's identity. Our other concerns include flooding. Chalfont Road was closed for a total of 9 weeks in the last year, and 29 cars were written off in the floodwater. Several neighbouring equestrian centres are now subject to enforcement orders from Transport for Bucks to deal with their surface water, which is overwhelming the Chalfont Road trenches, gullies and drains. The paddock to the rear of the application site regularly floods neighbouring residents' back gardens. The construction of housing on this piece of land threatens to exacerbate the problem by removing existing natural drainage of the site, albeit there are proposals to mitigate such flooding. Proper husbandry and management of the land is required rather than construction. Pedestrians. There's no pavement on the application site side of the road, and although all matters are reserved, there appears to be no provision for pedestrian on any of the images contained in the application. This presupposes use of the site by cars and bicycles mainly. Pedestrians wishing to walk in either direction will be obliged to cross the busy Chalfont Road at a point where cars are accelerating out of the village. Parking. The allowance of parking for 2 cars per 7-person dwelling is unrealistic and would lead to unacceptable parking on the Chalfont Road, with consequent traffic chaos, or indeed in Manor Road or Park Place. Sustainability. Cllr Green's limited facilities are already overstretched. Our school is heavily oversubscribed, as are those nearby. Access to medical care and other facilities are only available by car and infrequent bus services, whose timetables are such that they cannot even be used for commuting. And in conclusion, this development, if permitted, would permanently remove a precious parcel of green belt land hitherto untouched. This parcel of land was rejected for stage 2 of the HELAA and therefore meets the current criteria for retention as greenbelt land. We do not believe that the applicant has demonstrated the special circumstances necessary for permission to be granted for the building of these 8 houses. We do not want Cllr Green to lose its identity and become part of the urban sprawl that the greenbelt was designed to prevent. The greenbelt must be protected for the future, and we would urge you, please, to reject this application.
Thank you very much. I'll now ask Mike Shires, our Area Planning Officer, I think that's your title now, am I correct, to present the application. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just wanted to make one general point which applies to all the applications on the agenda tonight. As government guidance in the MPPF has been updated recently on the 20th of July, some of the paragraph numbers have changed in the MPPF. And none of the quoted paragraphs in the reports tonight have been materially changed in terms of the content, but the numbers are slightly different. So the main 2 are paragraphs 145 and 146 of the former version of the MPPF, which are listed in a few places in the report tonight. They set out the lists of development that are not inappropriate in the Greenbelt. They are the same, essentially, but are now paragraphs 149 and 150, so just wanted to point that out. So this application proposes the redevelopment of this site to provide 8 detached houses with access and parking. It's an outline application with all detailed matters reserved for a subsequent application. So it's simply the principle of the development that is for consideration tonight under this application. And the site plan that is provided is therefore just indicative of a possible layout. As you'll have noted from the report, the site is located on the outskirts of Cllr Green, and one of the biggest constraints is its location within the Greenbelt. In accordance with the MPPF and our local policies, it constitutes inappropriate development in the Greenbelt. Officers also have further concerns regarding the impact on the character of Cllr Green and also in relation to ecology and the required infrastructure contribution. In relation to the Greenbelt issue, the applicant also acknowledges that it comprises inappropriate development, but they've set out various issues that they consider constitute very special circumstances to outweigh the harm to the Greenbelt. Officers have looked at these, and we've set out the discussion in the report. As it concludes, we don't consider they're anywhere near sufficient to outweigh the harm to the Greenbelt. Consequently, the recommendation is to refuse permission for the 4 reasons listed in the report. And there's just 3 plans for this application. So the first one on the screen is the site location plan, just with the site outlined in red on the northwest side of Chalfont Road. And then I'll just put this in from our mapping system just to zoom out a little, give you a bit of context just to where the site is on the northern edge of Cllr Green. So you can see the edge of the settlement as houses opposite, and just to the north-east of the application site is the equestrian centre. Then this is the indicative site plan of how the applicant envisages the site could be laid out. It's sort of a double-ended cul-de-sac with a row of 8 detached houses there. And finally, I've just put in an aerial photo just showing a bird's eye view. It's not entirely up to date, but it's just to give you a flavour of the surroundings. It's part of that field with the equestrian centre just located over to the right-hand side. That's the presentation. Thanks, Chair.
Apologies, I keep forgetting about this microphone. I now open this to members for comment. Councillor Rush. Councillor Waters, sorry. I'm looking at Jonathan there, it's Councillor Waters, sorry.
Too many Jonathans, that's the trouble. I'm going to get quite directly to the point with this one, actually. I actually totally agree with the officer's analysis of this particular application. There are no sustainable special circumstances to overturn the importance of the Greenbelt for this development, the impact that it would have on Cllr Green, and looking at the site today, you know, it is totally devoid of any development, as you could see on. There's no buildings on the site at all. It's very clear to me that I think the officers have got this absolutely right, and obviously that would also support what the two speakers have said this evening as well. And I would support the recommendation for refusal very strongly.
Thank you very much. Councillor Darby, I think you were first.
Thank you, Chairman. Absolutely agree with everything that the officer has said, and also Councillor Waters. And one thing that struck me was that there was an indication of what it would look like, what it looks like with the trees now, and what it would look like. Not that one. There was another. I think it was no. It was on the report somewhere, or it might have been in one of their reports. I can't remember now because I've read quite a lot recently. But it actually showed the trees, the line of trees from the road, and then it superimposed the proposed dwellings behind. And it was really telling that the line of trees as it is now didn't have any leaves on, and you could quite clearly see gaps between them, and you can see quite clearly as the parish council has stated this evening, you could see the gaps in between, and then when it was superimposed with the buildings behind, all the trees have got leaves on, but they're not all coniferous trees, so you certainly would see an awful lot of the building, and it is absolutely inappropriate. This is a classic Greenbelt site that should remain a Greenbelt, in my view.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor MacBean. Sorry, was Councillor Harris for you first? Sorry.
Very succinctly, a very uninspiring, lacking any imagination in terms of the layout on a totally unsuitable site. I support what the officers have said in their report totally.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor MacBean.
Thank you, Chair. I echo what my colleagues have said. The Parish Council have raised particular concern over flooding. I'm a Chesham councillor. I love water and all things that go with it. Are we absolutely robust in our reasons for refusal? Is there anything that needs to be added in terms of water issues on the site? Because if this comes back again, we can't introduce new reasons. So I just want to make sure that officers have captured absolutely everything.
Mike.
Yes, that's a very good point. In the report, there's a section on flooding and drainage. We also had concerns about that actually initially when the application was submitted, and we got the Sustainable Drainage Officer to review the information. The applicant has actually carried out some quite detailed flooding calculations. They've tested the infiltration rates of the site to confirm the suitability of infiltration to dispose of surface water in the event of flooding, and that data, we're told, is acceptable by our sort of consultees. So they're basically saying we could deal with that as part of a reserved matters application if it was to get that far. So.
Okay, I always ask the question in case.
Thank you. Sorry, Councillor Walsh.
Yes, I must agree with everything that's been said because, I mean, the application, there are no very special circumstances. We would bring it within paragraph 145 of the MPPF, as you've said, Mr. Shaz, and there's nothing to make it an extraordinary exception. I forget the exact wording, but you know what I mean. There's no very special circumstances which would allow this to be built in the green belt, so I also support the officer's report and would reject the application.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other comments? Okay, are we happy to take this to vote then? Yeah? Okay, so any councillors for? Against? For refusing? for refusing. The recommendation is to... I'm really rusty, aren't I? I'm really rusty at this. And the recommendation is to refuse permission.
Chairman,
So,
sorry,
yes.
before you do the voting, could I just ask, did we appoint Councillor?
Yes.
We did.
We did.
Thank you.
We did. We did earlier on, yeah. Right, so back to the drawing board. The recommendation is to refuse permission. So can I ask who is for that recommendation? It seems to be unanimous. Thank you. Against? And abstains? No. Thank you very much. So that recommendation is accepted. We refuse permission for PL 20099 outline application. Yes. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Moving on to the next report, PL 20487 full application. Erection of 2 replacement 2-storey dwellings and 1 single-storey dwelling. I'm just thinking, would you prefer, before the speakers speak, to have the presentation by Mr. Shires? Would the members prefer that, to have that first before the speakers?
Yes, please.
Yes, okay, sorry. Mike, is that okay? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This application proposes the demolition of a series of buildings and the erection of 3 dwellings. The site is within the Greenbelt and the Chilterns AONB, and there was also a previous application on the site which went to appeal. That appeal was dismissed, but there are several important points to note from the Inspector's appeal decision. That appeal was actually a much larger site, which I'll point out when we go through the plans, and involved the construction of 7 new dwellings. Whilst most development is inappropriate in the Greenbelt, paragraph 149 of the MPPF outlines some exceptions to this, including the redevelopment of previously developed sites, i.e. brownfield land, provided it does not have a greater impact on the openness of the Greenbelt than the existing development, and it also allows for the replacement of certain buildings too. The application includes the demolition of a sizable dwelling, a large garage building and a former office building which has been used as a dwelling for the past few years. The 3 new dwellings would replace these, and I'll show you those in a moment, but 2 are 2 storeys and 1 is a bungalow. The gross external floor area in total of the development to be demolished is 786 square metres. Meanwhile, the proposed development of 3 dwellings would be 713 square metres in area, so there would be a reduction in footprint across the site. Initially, the siting of the dwellings was not considered acceptable, but the applicant has submitted amended plans moving the dwellings into a more compact layout, with 2 on the footprints of the buildings to be demolished. Given this, and mindful of the previous inspector's conclusions, officers consider that the scheme now complies with paragraph 149 of the MPPF in that it is redevelopment of previously developed land, and the new development would not have a greater impact on the openness of the Greenbelt than the existing buildings, so we have no objections in Greenbelt terms. In terms of the other main issues, the previous appeal inspector considered that the site currently detracts from the AONB landscape and sensitively designed dwellings would enhance the rural surroundings. In highway terms, the proposed dwellings would generate a similar number of vehicular movements to the buildings to be demolished, so the highways officer has no objections. There's nothing to update to the report itself, and the recommendation is to grant conditional permission. And you'll notice in the report we're recommending conditions to remove permitted development rights for all extensions and outbuildings to the new dwellings, as well as fencing in and around the site and various other conditions. So if I just take you through the plans, this shows the site location plan. It is showing a much wider site than the area of land which the proposal actually relates to. It's just all of the site as a whole. The existing site plan, so it's basically this central section here, and these are the buildings to be demolished in the centre. And the proposed site plans, so in the darker lines, are the 3 proposed dwellings. Bungalow is the eastern one, and then those 2 are 2 storeys. Those are the buildings to be demolished, or 2 of them anyway, so it's quite a sizable property. It's only 1 metre lower actually than the tallest of the dwellings to be constructed, and quite a large outbuilding as well. So moving to the proposed dwellings, this is plot 1. The appearance is they've sort of gone for a contemporary interpretation of the Chilterns vernacular, so the steep gables, the sort of materials are all sort of quite reflective of the children's, but just expressed in a more contemporary way. So that's plot 1, the elevations, and sort of artist sort of render of what it would look like along with the floor plans. Plot 2, similar sort of design with 2 gables on the front, and again an artist sort of render of what it would look like and the floor plans. And then plot 3 is the low single-storey bungalow, and that's the floor plan and the roof plan of the bungalow. And I've just slotted that in there, just a bird's eye view, just to give you some context. It's this section in the middle here where the dwellings would go. There are already sort of menage and a lot of hard-standing sort of dwellings down here in this corner and the wider site there. So it's this central section in the middle where the dwellings would go to replace the buildings that are currently there. The farm shop is just on this site to the south of the road. That's unconnected, but just to give it a bit of context. And that concludes the presentation.
Thank you. Before we ask for discussion, we have Rosemary Hall, the applicant, here tonight. Hello, Rosemary, welcome. Would you like to speak? Now, you have 3 minutes, as you've seen before the clock gets set. You can start whenever you feel comfortable.
Thank you. Can you press your button? Sorry.
Yes. Good evening. I'm Rosemary Hall, the applicant and the owner. I'm a divorced mum of 4 daughters and a son, and my aim is to live in plot 1. I also have an acute illness which will require a carer for a considerable part of my later life, and which I hope to envisage using plot 3. And one of my other daughters is hoping to live in plot 2, so it's going to be purely a family-owned and family-run small holding. I've had the 16 acres as part of my divorce settlement and inherited a lot of problems. I initially went to a developer and asked him if he would just apply for dwellings, which was refused, and actually in hindsight I'm pleased it was refused because I'm very environmentally conscious and I was not happy with that application. I intend making some improvements to the site and want to put a wildflower meadow between next to plot 1 and some orchard, and I intend planting a woodland in one of the fields to the rear of the properties and to make a lot of environmental improvements. I also intend building these houses in a very environmentally conscious way and heating them with ground source heat pumps and including rainwater harvesting and solar panels. I feel very strongly that I'm custodian of that piece of land, and although I'm only temporarily here, I want it to be somewhere that future generations can enjoy and not just somewhere that I own and live now, which is why I want to make improvements on that piece of land.
4 minutes, 5 minutes.
And that really is very important to me. And in order to be able to do that, I obviously want to live there. The house that's there at the moment is a very unsustainable house that would take a lot to improve what is there. So I'm just proposing that that's demolished, as well as the farm office, which is just a prefab building, and the garage, and erect these 2 eco-friendly, hopefully we can get to passive house status houses, and the 2-bedroom bungalow.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Right, can I open this for discussion then? Councillor MacBean.
Thank you, Chair. I have every sympathy with the applicant's personal situation, but for us it's about material planning reasons and the impact of this development. I mean, looking at that was the picture that interested me the most, the demolition of the existing buildings. And I just feel that plot 1, if my eyes aren't failing me, plot 1 is just a tad of overdevelopment. When you look at the aerial shot of the existing land, that is currently open land next to the Menage, I believe. Mike, am I right in saying? So to introduce another building, at the moment the two existing buildings are kind of nestled behind trees and fairly close to the hedgerow. But what we're doing is actually, you know, adding in a third building that at the moment sits in a fairly open plot. So I'm a little reluctant, and I just think it's slight overdevelopment. If this was for two fairly well-sized, well-spaced buildings on the footprint of the hard standing at the moment, I think I'd feel a little more comfortable with it.
Councillor Darby.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I'm troubled with this. I've sort of been to see it, and I've read the report, and I understand. I think the officers have been very fair, and the presumption is always in favour of development, but we do have green belts here, and I think that the officers' report has been very fair in the way that it said, well, you know, it's sort of no more than is there now. But what I would challenge is the positioning of the three dwellings. I mean, what we're talking about is, if I've got this right, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is we have three properties which are all habitable or potentially habitable. I think one is subject to a planning application of change of use, which is basically what's going to be plot 3. So you've got three dwellings, and you're talking about knocking them down and building three nicer dwellings, which is absolutely laudable. And you know, I applaud the applicant's intention of making these, you know, making these passive house or whatever. But the big thing for me is that we seem to be taking down. I think it's the dwelling above some garages, which is, I believe, sort of this side of the plot, sort of tucked away in some trees almost, and next to, I believe it's called the Retreat. I don't know, Mike, if you want to change the plan, you might be able to show it on the plan. So if you go back a bit more, I think, to the site plan. Sorry, right at the beginning of the presentation. Go back one more. Right, so you can see next to the Retreat there's a square box, and I believe that square box, am I right? No, down a bit. Is that square box, is that the garage with the accommodation above? And if you go to the next screen where you show it's gone. Now that, to me, that place there, that's tucked away, that really isn't having an impact upon the openness of the green belt. But I'm really, really sorry that plot 1, and having stood there today, just looking across, you're talking about putting a sizable dwelling there, which is going to have a ridge height 1 metre taller than the property that is going to be taken down on plot 2. You're putting in a huge obstacle to the openness of the green belt, in my view, and that really concerns me. And I'm going to have to hear some really good arguments for why I shouldn't be worried about that plot.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Rush.
That was quick. I can't see you. I haven't got eyes in the back of my head. I mean, I agree with what Councillor Darby and Councillor MacBean have said. The other thing I wanted to add, or one thing I wanted to add, was the officer's report uses the expression, the harm to openness would be offset by the improvements to the openness of the green belt. I do vaguely remember that the previous chairman of this committee and some officers came down like a ton of bricks on me when we used the expression offset. If something is going into the green belt, it's in the green belt. I mean, they made good reasons to approve it, but the word offset did strike me as, now I've lost my place on that. The other thing I wanted to query was in the appendices, I think there was a reference to building regulations. So just a minor query, which I've already put to you, Mike, and that is perhaps you could clarify that. That's all I really want to say, apart from, I'm afraid I will have to vote against this recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Rush. Councillor Waters.
Yes, I think most things have been said. I think it is one of the key things is, I know that we've talked about footprint and square meterage, but actually some of this is really actually what is built on the footprint, which is the bulk, and that is actually the impact that you have within the green belt in terms of vision across an open space. And like Councillor Darby, looking across an area which was very, very open against an area where it is quite enclosed and nearer to other properties where you're actually going to remove the garage stroke flat area, that isn't going to compensate by removing that for actually starting to move into another area and then maybe put other fields at risk in the long term. And I know the applicant has made lots of very good reasons for personal need, but that unfortunately is something we can't take into account when we're actually dealing with planning matters. We have to look at it as if tomorrow somebody else is going to come into that location, and actually how much development is going on there. There were also a few concerns in terms of design, in terms of balconies and overlooking, but they're minor in comparison with, particularly on again, number one, in terms of. So I think the thinking would be if they would two houses within the other area, or even if the third was back where those garages were, actually you're not going to be making an impact so much onto the open area. But once you start going further into the fields behind, I think there is no way that you can say there isn't an impact, and I don't see an overriding reason for doing that, because it is moving it into another area. It isn't actually just developing on top of where there is current built form. So actually that is really the difference on it from my point of view. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? The recommendation here is conditional permission, but I'm thinking, would members be happier if we deferred this application to let the applicant revise the plans with the planning officers, or would members like to take a vote on Councillor MacBean?
As a member of this committee for the last 6 years, I mean, this is not a minor amendment to small details. This is the wholesale removal. That's the message I'm getting from colleagues. This is the wholesale removal of a plot. I do believe applicants can withdraw an application and come back with a new set of plans, which is what I think this might need. You know, whether it's moving that house or, you know, reducing it or changing location. But maybe the legal officer or Mike can give us some advice. But I think we're talking a major change, so I don't think it's a deferral. A deferral is if we're seeking further clarification, or if we want some minor amendments made and the participant is open to it. But I think this is something else, really.
Can we take your views on this?
Yes. I mean, I'm just going to take a step back and just say how we sort of assess the impact on the openness. Obviously, we've looked at the site as a whole and looked at the volume and the built form and the footprint, and concluded that across the height of the site as a whole, it's not materially greater. As I said earlier, the footprint is actually slightly less. But I do take your point about plot one. You know, that is a fair point in terms of that currently being on open land. So I'm not going to argue too much for that. That is a fair point. I mean, one solution you could do is to ask us to negotiate with the applicant to ask if they'd be willing to remove that property or substitute that property for the bungalow maybe in plot one, and we can bring it back to committee, but with authorisation to refuse it on greenbelt grounds if they don't want to amend it.
Councillor Darby.
My apologies, as I'm rather new to this game, but my understanding was that you looked at the plan that was in front of you, and whilst you could have opinions as to what could be done to make it better, to make it acceptable, I think what needs to be done with this one would cause all manner of problems. So, for instance, plot 3 is a single-storey dwelling at the moment. If you start jiggling things around, you will be putting a 2-storey dwelling very, very close to Peterlee House. I'm sorry, I don't think I'd be happy with the deferral. I really wouldn't.
Okay. Councillor MacBean.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with Councillor Darby. And, you know, my problem with that plot is, I mean, I've been involved for a few years and I know the history of this site and have made many site visits. And, you know, we've got the menage at the moment, but what we're actually introducing is precedent that we have another building there. And I can see in a short hop, skip and a jump that suddenly we've put an additional building. I think this is a major, major change. You know, I mean, I would be happy, well, I think we either need to approve or refuse it. You know, I am cognizant of the fact that the applicant may wish to withdraw it, but if they get refusal now, I think I'm right in saying they can come back for a second application on the same site with major changes, and it's not punitive in terms of cost and impact. But I think I would be more inclined to refuse this than defer.
That's my understanding. Can we still go ahead with, is that still the case? It's not changed, the rule hasn't changed.
I mean, there's no sort of technical limit as to how much you can change. It's down to sort of the merits of each case. You could simply ask them to remove plot 1 and amend it that way and just leave everything else as it is, because that's already been assessed in terms of the other impact. So it's not introducing any new development, it's just simply removing something. So it's not quite so major in that respect. But yeah, I mean, I agree, you know, changing dwellings around is probably a bit more major. But it's up to you if you want us to ask the applicant to remove plot 1 and then bring it back to committee, or if you want to go straight to refusal, and that's your call.
Okay. No, I think my reading is we want to take a vote. Sorry, Councillor Darby.
I was only going to say I think it's just too complicated to just remove plot 1, because then the question would be is are you still demolishing the garages?
We'll just go to vote.
It's far too complicated to do that. I really do think we need to have another fresh look at this.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so we'll go to vote then. The recommendation for this. Oh, sorry, Councillor Rush, didn't see your hand there.
Only just raised. I wonder if Mike could come back to my 2 queries about the use of the word offset when looking at judging the impact on the greenbelt, and secondly the fact that building regs have crept their way into the, rather mention of building regs have crept into the appendices. If you could just comment on those 2 things, I'd be grateful.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch all of that. Actually, the acoustics up here are pretty terrible. Would you mind just saying that again?
John, here we go. Yes, I wonder if you could come back, Mike, and just clarify the use of the word offset in judging the impact on the green belt. As I said before, I seem to remember that it was a word that we weren't allowed to use when assessing the impact before. And secondly, in the appendices, there is a paragraph on building regulations, which I suppose may have been put in there for information, but nonetheless it's not material planning, is it?
Yeah, well, it's paragraph 5.19, isn't it, where we say the harm to the openness of, in respect of the new dwellings would be offset. We're basically saying where as Councillor Darby mentioned earlier, where the existing building to be demolished sort of down on this section here, just where the cursor is showing it on the screen. We're basically saying the greater harm to the openness sort of up here is offset by improving the openness down this section. I mean, obviously that's a fairly subjective opinion, so you're perfectly entitled to not agree with that, but there is some kind of offsetting there, which is what we meant in the report.
Is that okay, Councillor Rush?
Sorry, was the question building regs to do with the consultee?
In the appendices, it makes reference to building regs. It's the first time I've seen that in a planning report, that's all.
Yes, that's under the consultee responses, just on page 51, isn't it? Building control officer. Yeah, so obviously extra keen when they did that response because they've listed some of the building regs that it needs to comply with, which obviously isn't a consideration for us under the planning application, but I think they're just setting it out for the benefit of the applicants.
Okay, anybody else? Right, I'll take this to the vote then. The recommendation is...
Apologies, Chairman.
Sorry.
We need a proposer and a seconder for the motion to be carried correctly.
Okay, right.
Thank you.
No, we didn't do that. No. Well, no, we didn't do it last time.
No, we didn't do it last time. So
We
it's
don't
not
usually, no, well,
constitutional, so we need to do this one and then we need to revisit the last one.
yes, what?
If you could do the proposed one for this one, then we can go back to the other one.
Okay, right. So we need a proposer for this recommendation for conditional permission for this particular application. So... No, the recommendation is conditional permission, so...
Is anyone prepared to recommend it for that?
Yeah. So no. Okay, so
Someone has to put
so now we have to put forward a recommendation for this application.
I'd like to recommend that this application is refused, Chair.
Thank you. Be a seconder for that. Thank you very much. So the recommendation is that we refuse this planning application. Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, well, you still want us to vote? We had to with 3 seconders. Yeah, Councillor Rush. I'm getting all confused now. Okay, we've got a proposer as Jane. Councillor Rush seconded. Okay, right, okay then. So can we now take a vote on...
Sorry, could you ask what the refusal is? Which is Greenbelt.
Yeah, we need reasons, don't we? I was going to do that afterwards.
Oh, okay. It's quite handy.
You want the refusal?
Proposed an actual reason.
Okay, okay. The officer is saying, Councillor MacBean, he wants the reasons for refusal now, not after we've taken the vote.
So, and I'm sure Mike will correct me if I'm wrong and enhance my refusals, but I think on the grounds that plot 1 is harmful to the openness of the green belt. It's not in keeping with green belt policy. It has an impact on the openness. Any other reasons? I think character and appearance of the AOMB. Thank you, Councillor Darby. Oh, Mike's sucking lemons. Maybe not.
I think sort of listening to the discussion, your main objection does seem to be the green belt, isn't it, and the harm to the openness. I think if you go down the character of the area route, you're then making it extremely difficult if they come back with 2 dwellings, because you've already...
The main impact is that plot on the openness of the green belt. Yeah.
Okay, is that Councillor Rush?
Well, actually, I was looking at paragraph 3.13, which was the refusal for the 7 dwellings. I thought that was quite a good guide. It sort of covers what Councillor MacBean was saying. It's page 36, I think. And,
Sorry,
I leave it up to you. Sorry.
Councillor Rush, I couldn't hear what... None of us have heard what paragraph you're talking about.
Is it paragraph 3.13, page 36? It's from the. It's from the.
I'm with you. Yeah, that was the previous one. Can we put that in as a...
Yeah, sort of
adapt it and put that in as well? Okay.
We'll leave you to tweak it, Mr.
Yeah.
Schatz. We'll delegate to us.
Right, so we have our reasons for refusal, we have our proposer, we have our seconder, so now we take the vote. And the vote is to refuse this application. Who agrees? Yeah, everybody, and myself. Right, so that application is refused on the basis as per discussion. Thank you. Now, the legal officer wants us to go back to the first one. So you want us to propose the refusal.
I'm happy to propose that we refuse that application.
And Councillor Waters will second. Can we take a vote to refuse that application? Thank you. Right. And then we come on to the last application tonight, which, when I find it, is PL20-4289, a full application. Recommendation is conditional permission. Would you like to do the presentation first? And then we have a speaker, I believe, Mr. Connolly. Yeah, that's yourself. Hello. Right. Go ahead. Oh, Jonathan, you put your microphone off.
Thank you, Chair. This application proposes the conversion of an existing barn to a dwelling, which would be served by an existing access onto Church Road in Penn. The site is within the Greenbelt, AONB, and next to the Penn and Tyler's Green Conservation Area, but not directly within it. As stated in the report, one of the exceptions to inappropriate development in the Green Belt, set out in paragraph 149 of the MPPF, is the reuse of buildings, provided that the building is of permanent and substantial construction. That's mirrored fairly closely in local plan policy GB11. In this case, very few alterations are proposed to the building, as it is a substantially built barn. Unusually for a barn conversion, the roof and the walls will be retained as they are, and just 7 new windows inserted. The extensive tree screening will remain, and the garden area is being kept small following advice from officers, where initially a much larger garden was proposed. A sizable area of concrete hardstanding will be removed from within the site and replaced with a smaller area of permeable surfacing too. As the MPPF supports this type of conversion, it is therefore considered that the proposal is acceptable in Greenbelt terms. In terms of the impact on the AONB and the nearby conservation area, the gaps between the buildings are clearly important for the character of the village. In this case, the building already exists, and it is set to one side of this particular wide gap to the north side of Church Road. A sizable gap would therefore remain, and in practice the site would look very little different to the present situation, particularly as the tree screening would remain and the building is virtually invisible from the street. Officers therefore consider the conversion to be acceptable, and the recommendation is to grant conditional permission. You'll notice we're recommending conditions to remove all permitted development rights, to extend and also for outbuildings, also to prevent additional hardstanding and fencing within the plot, to prevent external lighting and to secure long-term ecological improvements too. So if I just run through the plans. So on the screen is the site location plan with the site outlined in red. The blue line just shows the land within the ownership of the applicant adjoining the site, which doesn't form part of this application. This is the proposed site plan, so the existing barn is just retained as it is there. Existing access leading onto Church Road just at the bottom. There's currently a section of concrete hardstanding which extends further into the plot, which is proposed to be removed and replaced by this permeable driveway, and then the rest would be grassed amenity area with the majority of trees, especially the ones around the edge, remaining. This just shows the existing building. So there's already 3 roof lights in the roof slopes, that's existing. And then the proposed elevations just showing the windows. When the application first came in, it did have a couple of extra windows. We've got the applicant to amend that slightly and reduce the number of openings in the building. Also, they did propose a larger porch when it first came in, which we've got them to get down to simply just this little bit of roof overhang just over the front door. And then the floor plan, it's a 1-bedroom dwelling, and the roof plan. And then I've just put in a few photos submitted by the applicant as part of the design and access statement. It's quite a substantially built building, actually. These are, as I said earlier, unusually for a barn conversion. All the external coverings are to remain, the roof, the walls. Those of you that have been on a committee for a while will know that in planning terms, conversion, all you have to retain is the structural elements, and a lot of conversions do involve new roofs and new walls, so it's quite unusual in that respect that there's not much changing. The inside is a substantial concrete floor slab. It's pretty substantial for conversion. And then just the second sheet of photos, just this one here just shows looking from within the site out towards the gated access. That's existing concrete, which would be removed. just showing the existing access. It's quite a wide access, 2 gates width onto the road, and this is literally at the front of the site looking at the building, and that view would be a little different to as it is currently. That screens the building from the street. So the recommendation is to grant conditional permission. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Good evening, Chairman and Councillors. I'm Michael Connolly, the agent and architect for the application. I really only wish to address some of the objections that were raised, as the application has been very well presented by your officer. First of all, to say a bit more about the building, a structural survey was carried out as part of the application process and was an application document. This confirmed that with fairly limited repairs, which are some just to the guttering, the building can be retained and upgraded to form a dwelling. Most of the upgrading is just in terms of insulation to ensure we comply with the building regulations. They're concerned about the impact on the conservation area. The conservation areas are to the south of the site, and a site visit will show that the building is barely visible from the conservation area at the other side of the road. And the conservation area on the same side of the road is at least 50 metres away. So the impacts on those heritage assets we believe to be less than harmful. A concern was also raised that we are rezoning the site to take it out of Greenbelt and AONB. However, the granting of approval will not take it out of these policy designations, and the site will remain washed over by Greenbelt and AONB. Concerns were raised about future development elsewhere on the site. However, no proposals were put forward as part of this application, and the application should only be determined on the basis of the proposals that have been put before you. There's also a concern raised by a neighbour that they had not been consulted after a statement had been made by the applicant that they had been consulted, but I think this was an error, and it was actually information provided by the council. There's concern on the impact of the proposals on the property to the west of the storage barn, Oldfields, but this is at least 40 metres away, and as a condition, the applicant would be happy for the western boundary to be strengthened with additional planting. It still already has reasonably good planting along that boundary. 2 other items. This application falls completely within the exceptions to inappropriate development in the Greenbelt, as noted previously in paras 145 and 146, and restated in the officer's report, which are now paragraphs 149. In that this application falls fully within the exceptions, in that with regard to paragraph 145, it is now an exception which includes the reuse of buildings, provided that the building is permanent and substantial construction, and that it is. And also with regard to paragraph 146, which allows the reuse of agricultural buildings as residential dwellings. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, what I will start by just saying is I asked for this to come in because obviously any change of use from a barn within this sort of protected area gives me some concern, particularly with historical reasons. And so one of the things which is important was that a lot of the items which are actually in this report have answered lots of my questions on it, but the officers did not ask me before 7 days before it went onto the list whether I wanted it to go on the list or not, in which case I would have withdrawn it. I had particular concerns, and they have been answered on things like controlling the extension of hard standing, which is one of the benefits of actually, in terms of reducing the impact in the area. I think the amendments which have been made were acceptable, and the structure and soundness of it is obviously very clear from the photographs. So I would be very clear that I would not have been calling this in at this meeting given that time, so I would apologise to the agent for that. I've been away until Sunday, but there is nothing in my inbox nor anything on my phone to tell me that this was coming in. What I would just want to just quickly check, though, seeing we are here, is the bathroom window, is that obscure glazed? The one on the side? Because that's the only one that really impacts a neighbour.
We're happy to have a condition that is obscure glazed.
If you could, I think that's always a useful thing to do in bathrooms, particularly at ground level.
Very small windows. So you have
Very, very small, but probably for the people who are actually in there, let alone anybody else, it's probably a good thing. So that would be the only thing that I would actually ask to be added to it. So apologies that you actually have got this on the list. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Actually, could you just pull up the plan, please, for which shows the view with all the trees on it? The plan. Yeah. Yes.
It's back to location plan.
Yeah. Actually, perhaps I'm being slightly facetious here. I was just wondering what tree that was, the top right. It's very big.
I wasn't sure if that was rhetorical or whether you were expecting me to answer. It's outside the site, so unfortunately I don't know. It's not something we've consulted the tree officer on specifically.
Just staying on that photo, I'm really glad to see the word permeable because that is a particular hobby horse of mine. That is a huge amount of hard standing being introduced in actually what at the moment is a rural area. Yeah, there's a lot of scope there for future development on, what is being established as hard standing. It seems very excessive when you look at it compared to the building itself. It's very nice to see a barn conversion where the structure is actually being used, because time and time again we've had an argument over what constitutes the original structure, and I've seen some very decidedly ropey structures that people claim. So it's really nice actually to see that the original materials and the structure is being reused. But yeah, I do harbour some concerns about that hard standing, and it looks like a lovely future plot for me for a second dwelling or an entranceway into the back of the plot, but maybe I've spent too many years on this committee and I'm deeply cynical.
When you look at it, actually, it's a massive reduction from the concrete that's currently there and the permeable surface of it. And you do have to turn within the area because that is a pretty busy road. So actually, the other issues we have of people in other areas backing onto the road, you won't get that there. So there is some relevance to it. So there's a positive to it. So I don't think we would have an issue with that. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions. I've got one of the plans off the website, which has actually got the bit behind, which is also within ownership, and it clearly shows on there access gate for maintenance at the back of this plot. And the question in my mind, and it perhaps echoes some of Councillor MacBean's thoughts, is at the moment, is that current entrance the only entrance onto the whole of that area of land? Question one. And question two, if it is, how is access going to be gained to the area of land not on the application if this application goes ahead and goes into separate ownership, and then that brings up the question of this access gate for maintenance, which is shown at the back of the site. I can't actually read what it says up there, but my thought is that somehow one can drive all the way through, and I think that is sort of perhaps what Councillor MacBean is concerned about for the future. We've got a couple of parking spaces blocking the way at the moment, but how will the landowner get to the bit of land that's not part of this application? And sorry, while I have the floor, the other question on the bathroom is, can it be a sort of a small opening window, like a fan light, rather than the whole window being able to be thrown wide open? Because if it's obscured glass, if you throw the window wide open, it's not obscured anymore.
Yeah, thanks. I'll take those in turn. In terms of the wider site, yes, I mean, there's another drawing which is similar to this, but it's got a triangular shape of land on top of it. So I didn't put that in the presentation, just up to the key ones. That's actually covered in the ecology condition because they're aiming to provide the biodiversity net gain on the site. They're proposing to have that area of land managed to improve biodiversity, so wild grassland, as well as the application site. So that's why that was included. When you sort of permit a barn conversion, or indeed any application for a new dwelling, all you're permitting to change to residential is the red line on the site location plan denoting the site, which is simply that. So it doesn't change any of the use of that blue line at all. It's simply the red line, which is, they did a pre-app, as I mentioned earlier, and the red line was probably twice the size of that, actually extended back. That was one thing we fed back and said it's got to be a lot smaller. So that's simply the area of land that will be changed use, just shown there. In terms of the access to the wider site, I don't know if there are any other accesses to it. We didn't look into that in great detail because it's all shown to be under the control of the applicant here. It's not really possible to take that into account under this application because the applicant is showing they've got control over the whole of that land with the blue line. I think we may have queried it more if they didn't control that land at all. That was in a third-party ownership. But in terms of the merits of the application, whether they drive through the site, through a gate...
to sell it next week, Mike. You know, once they build, once they convert, they could sell that property on, and that does leave the issue of how that wider parcel is accessed.
Could I just clarify this? The whole of that land is owned by the applicant at the moment. It could be sold at any time. The applicant used to live opposite, and they just retained that land, and they've retained it for many, many years. The applicant is now quite elderly. If they sell it, I would imagine they would have to sell because you need a planning consent to put another access into the blue-rimmed land. So effectively, you're keeping the blue land, you know, safe with the red marked area. But, you know, it's not that the garden's been reduced. Initially, we put the garden into line with the back of the gardens beside it. We had advice from the officers to reduce it in size, which is why it looks a little bit contrived. But it's all under one legal title. And also, you know, if anybody wanted to develop it, they'd have to go through the whole process of a planning application. And doubtless at that point, after hearing the limited development refusal, I can see which way that would go. It does. It probably protects it more than it's protected at the moment.
I take everything you're saying. It is a nice big blue tempting space there, isn't it, for future development? But I do wonder about setting precedent as well by allowing this proposal. Then you're changing an agricultural building to a residential dwelling, which then might set precedent for the future application. But I'm sure Councillor MacBean's got much more knowledge than me.
Well, yeah, I still bear the scars from Chalk Lane in Hyde Heath, where, yeah, and under regulations, under planning law now, we can convert agricultural buildings, and quite often they can be done under. Can they be done under PD? Yeah, they can, can't they? Well, depending on the extent, you know, if, especially with a building like this where you've got an integral structure that is sound, then you could put a variation application or something and put in a few windows and some doors and hey ho, off you go, kind of thing. So I appreciate you brought this to commit, to planning, and it's a full application, and we can consider all matters. I mean, I personally think it's quite a nice application. I like the fact that the wider plot is protected. Again, that could change at any point in the future, but it would have to come back. And I like the fact that they would have to come back for another access point, because it is a very busy road and we'd need serious highways consideration of new access points being created. And I think it's actually, compared to many I've seen, it's actually a nice conversion. It sits in quite a large plot. I mean, as the agent has said, the garden could have extended much further, but actually there's a degree of protection because it's got a lot more amenity space than many that have come up in my ward especially, and in many other areas of under our remit. So I actually, I did wonder why Councillor Waters had called it in. He's obviously had some initial concerns and those have been addressed. So I'm confident that, we would probably lose this at an appeal. I can't see any obvious reasons for turning it down, and I actually think it's quite a nice, modest conversion compared to many that I've seen.
Just want to make one more. I just want to reiterate the point about the bathroom window, because I did note there was an objection from the people next door about being overlooked. So I just want to echo that comment as well.
Can we make that a condition?
We're happy to put a condition on, about the bathroom window being obscure glazed, but I'll just draw your attention to the distance involved. I mean, we didn't put the condition on the report because one of the tests for conditions is that it's got to be necessary, i.e. the planning application would be refused without it. And are you saying you'd refuse a tiny clear glazed window there, which is probably 40, 50 metres?
There was a photo from the objector from their garden, I think, which showed the side of the barn. So I wouldn't hold out much hope in the event of an appeal, if an applicant appealed against that condition with that distance involved, but happy to put the condition on. So,
Mike, is it the fact that it's on the ground floor? I mean, we got an extension on our house and we've got a wide opening bathroom window that isn't even obscure glaze, but it looks onto a brick wall, and I think there's a small window to one side, but it's at first floor level, so you haven't got people constantly walking past. I mean, I do tend to agree with officers. My eyesight is failing me in my dotage, but usually at things that are close by. I mean, there is quite a bit of distance, but I mean, personally, if I had a bathroom window on the ground floor, I'd quite like it to be obscured glazing and kind of limited opening, because, little darlings climbing out of windows and absconding, or maybe that's just my house, but, it also gives a degree of protection. Again, the agent is here. I don't know if it's a very, very minor amendment that maybe we can delegate to the officers to have a further conversation and we can approve it on the basis, and I don't think it's a huge...
Can I confirm it would be limited opening? It wouldn't be the whole window opening, which negates. I mean, I understand the distance from the property next door, but the distance from the boundary is pretty minimal. And it's, are you saying that just because it's somebody's garden, that therefore it doesn't matter? Because I really do believe it does.
We'd put standard obscure glaze condition, which is, basically in the government guidance, which is wholly obscure glazed, and then none opening up to eye level, so it's 1.7 metres above the floor level. So.
Sorry, all this is on offer. I'm just wanting to make sure we get this absolutely correct this time. We come to no more comments, so we'll come to the vote. As I understand, we need a proposer for the recommendation, which is conditional permission. Councillor Harris, thank you. And a seconder. Councillor MacBean, thank you. And can we now take it to the vote? Who is for recommending conditional permission for this application? Thank you, that's carried. Thank you very much. That's the end of our applications for tonight, so the formal part of this meeting is now closed. Thank you very much, Mr Connolly. Thank you, everybody else. And can I ask the committee just to stay behind for 5 minutes with the officers to update you on a couple of things. Thank you very much.